Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be moving into our discussion of what gets termed the Southwest, and I think the best way to begin most of these transitions is by looking at how we define these terms, how we define these concepts that we're going to be looking at. So this is going to be a part one of a multi-part lecture discussing how we understand the Southwest as a region and how that informs our views about Native peoples and their cosmologies, lifeways, and contemporary issues. So what defines the Southwest? I think maybe if we look at this in 4 or 5 different angles in this lecture, it might help us to come to an understanding of that. First of all, we're going to look at where is the Southwest, what is the Southwest, when is the Southwest, who is included in the Southwest, and why does this matter? You see here an image of Spider Rock at Canyon de Chelly in the Navajo Nation. One of the most truly beautiful natural landscapes I've ever had the privilege of being able to see. If you ever get a chance to visit Canyon de Chelly, I highly recommend it. We look at North America as a whole here, the 50,000 mile view, if you will. The Southwest culture area is genuinely in the southwestern-ish part of the continent, though if this were strictly true, then Baja California could not be excluded, hence the hedging on the pure geographic definition. In some discussions, the region is described as Arid America or Oasis America, rather than the Southwest. And these terms might actually be more universal, as we shall see, but to avoid confusion, we'll continue using the term Southwest in rabbit ear quotation marks while recognizing the problems inherent in the use of that term. Zooming in a little bit. Here you can see central North America, if you will, and voila, the Southwest, as it's usually understood in an oval sense. One term I have often seen used is from Durango to Durango, right? Durango, Colorado to Durango, Mexico, in a north-south range. Actually does a fair job of describing it, plus or minus a little space. East-west is a little bit more tricky. There's no convenient towns placed at the east and west corners. But this gives you an idea of where it's situated vis-a-vis California, the Great Basin, the plains. Zooming in a little bit more, we can see here a closer view of that Four Corners region, right? You can see there towards the top, near the top dead center of this particular photograph, you can see where the states of Utah, top left, Colorado, top right, New Mexico, bottom right, and Arizona, bottom left, all come together in a perfectly perpendicular spot. Another neat place to visit. You can actually have a hand in 2 states and a foot in 2 states, and so your body could be in 4 states simultaneously. Fun things that you get to do when you're able to travel and you don't think about as much. But you can see here, this does give you a fair idea, zoomed in enough to see some of the major features of this area that I want you to keep in mind. Along the top there, you can see the snow-capped peaks of the Rockies and the Wasatch Range there in Utah. You can see the Rocky Mountains really rising up to a much higher elevation. That's very key in terms of defining what the northern kind of areas that provide a fuzzy, admittedly, but a boundary to the Southwest. Along the left-hand side of this, you can see very clearly the course of the Colorado River as it cuts along the southeast corner of Nevada and along our California's border with Arizona there, before emptying out into the Sea of Cortez. You can see all of that agriculture there in the Coachella Valley, right there along the very edge of the photograph. You can see the central plateaus of this area. You can even see the Grand Canyon there in the northern part of Arizona. If you go just east from that big blue part there in Nevada, at the southeast corner of Nevada, that's Lake Mead below the above the Hoover Dam. You go east from there and you can see the Grand Canyon. You can also see coming up from the bottom right part of the photograph where Texas kind of, its little El Paso wedge there kind of cuts in underneath New Mexico. That's the course of the Rio Grande, which then moves up through central New Mexico all the way up to the Rocky Mountains. And it's along that Rio Grande corridor that many of the Pueblo peoples had their traditional towns at the time of European contact. So between the Colorado and the Rio Grande and the Rocky Mountains to the north and the Sierra Madre Occidental in the south, these are some of the major geographic features that you need to understand when you're talking about this culturally fascinating region. So, what are some of the things? What is the Southwest? What defines it as being distinct from California or the Great Basin or the Plains, for example? Well, California Great Basin and the Plains, one of the things that's very clear in terms of subsistence that's distinct is that the Southwest, here you have Hopi corn and a Hopi gentleman showing traditional techniques. Maize agriculture. Maize agriculture defines not just the subsistence pattern, but so much of the cosmological existence of the people of the Southwest that it is essential in our definition of what this region is. Additionally, the use of ceramics. In contrast to many areas of California, the Great Basin, and the Plains, where you do see some late traditions and within the last 1,000 years or a little bit earlier in some of these adjacent areas, ceramic technology is never very fully developed in most of these areas. They do make ceramics in the Great Basin, but they are very, very plain, very simple forms without a whole lot of elaboration. In the Southwest, ceramics go well beyond simple functional forms and enter into the realm of true art. Here you can see an example of a ceramic vessel created by Nampeyo in the early 20th century. She's one of the mothers of the revitalization of ceramic arts among First Nations of the Southwest. And it's largely due to her and another woman by the name of Maria Martinez that tradition was in some ways resurrected and now is a major component to the art scene of the Southwest. And they deserve a great deal of credit for that revitalization. But it goes without saying then that the importance and production of both large quantities and technically sophisticated forms of these vessels is another thing that distinguishes the Southwest from adjacent areas. Also, settled village life. This is Acoma Pueblo. This is the longest continuously occupied spot on the North American continent. No other place has seen a continuous occupation as a town than this place. I don't mean that, if you have a house that's built on top of a Clovis site, that counts. We're talking about continuous occupation by families that are descended from the families that were living there 600 years ago. That's definitional for the Southwest. Even the villages of California's southern coast or the Central Valley, even camps in the Great Basin and on the Plains, never even approach the consistency and constancy of occupation that these towns and villages of the Southwest did. How do we define some of the other boundaries, particularly those to the south? It's a little bit tougher. For example, the Southwest basically includes the northernmost extension of the maize agricultural complex directly from Mesoamerica, the place of origin for this whole tradition. Interestingly enough, the eastern portions of North America saw cultural and technological influences from the Caribbean as well as from Mesoamerica, not to the exclusion of Mesoamerica, but there were a number of different routes into the southeast and eastern seaboard of the United States that create a different pattern of adoption of things like ceramics and agriculture, as we'll see. And the varieties of maize that were introduced into the eastern half of North America, they were introduced much later. And so you had different varieties of maize being grown there, adopted and adjusted and modified by the native peoples of the eastern seaboard. So they were beginning from a different starting point. And so it's a different branch on this tree of the maize tradition. Additionally, agriculture emerged independently in the eastern woodlands of North America. And that's key. It did not emerge independently in the southwest part of the continent. It was introduced directly, along with a whole bunch of cosmological aspects and symbols and rituals associated with that particular crop. And as important as it is, that means that the connections that link the Southwest to particularly Western Mesoamerica are deeper and in some ways more intense. And very critically, ceramics were independently invented rather than introduced as a complete package along with agriculture, as happened in the area here under discussion in the eastern woodlands. And so in the eastern woodlands, they're independently developing agriculture, independently developing ceramics, whereas the Southwest has these things introduced directly from highland Mexico. The eastern agricultural complex of the Ohio and Mississippi river valleys begins sometime around 3000 BCE, very, very early. In some ways earlier in the middle Ohio, middle Missouri, upper Mississippi, then we see maize being consistently used as a staple in Mesoamerica. So the points of origin for these two different the agricultural complexes, the maize agricultural complex and the Eastern North American agricultural complex, they begin around the same times in their respective areas. Here you can see some of the crops that were part of the Eastern agricultural complex: sumpweed, lamb's quarters, squash, a local variety of squash. It's a really beautiful example. It looks delicious. And sunflowers. A lot of people don't realize this, but sunflowers were actually domesticated in the Ohio River Valley initially and have since spread around the world. Another contribution of native innovation and expertise that has benefited the rest of the world. Also, you can see here, these are examples of the Stallings Island plainware ceramics, work done particularly by the archaeologist Ken Sassaman. Shout out to Ken if you're listening. That are older than the oldest ceramics in the Southwest and contemporary, at least as old as the oldest ceramics in southern Mesoamerica. And those traditions, the barraware and mocaya traditions, which are believed to have been a technology introduced from South America by way of Central America. So the Mesoamerican ceramic tradition is introduced from the south, and the Stallings Island stuff here from centered in Georgia, but also found in some of the adjacent states, South Carolina, North Carolina, a little bit west and tiny bit into northern Florida, very, very little. But that tradition that you see on the map there, the ceramics on the right are these fiber-tempered, relatively low-fired ceramics, but they almost certainly represent an independent invention of ceramics here that then joined into the Eastern Agricultural Complex from the Ohio River Valley to the northwest, and created a whole different point of origin for the histories in the eastern part of North America, particularly east of the Mississippi. And so when maize does eventually get introduced into the eastern part of the continent, it's actually coming in and replacing a lot of these native crops that we just showed. It doesn't replace sunflower. Sunflower actually gets introduced into Mesoamerica as a result of these contacts. So the exchange was two ways in the eastern part of the continent. But maize comes in, and it's so productive and so incredible as a crop that it has the ability to displace a lot of these much earlier and incredibly healthy and high in protein. There's nothing wrong with the indigenous crops of the Ohio River Valley, but they just weren't quite as productive as maize. But it's people adopting a new crop rather than people learning how to do agriculture from the beginning. And so their traditions of fertility and rainfall and spiritualism and symbolism associated with agriculture were already somewhat developed prior to the introduction of maize. And so this is one of the differences between the Southwest and the Eastern agricultural traditions in the continent. So we can kind of see a boundary here. Somewhere on the plains, there's a boundary between a very distinct historical tradition in the eastern part of the continent. And that boundary to the south, well, it does lack distinction. It lacks more distinction. The boundary of the Southwest to on its southern edge lacks lacks any of the distinction that it has between California, areas to the north, areas to the east. This southern boundary is one of the trickiest ones to figure out. But we can list a few things that are present in Mesoamerica that we do not see in the Southwest. So it's more of a definition by absence rather than presence, with all of the attendant logical philosophical problems of defining things by absence. But first of all, state-level political organizations, like we see among the Teotihuacanos, the Toltec, the Aztec, the Maya, the Purepecha, the Tarascan Empire, in Oaxaca, among the Mixtec. All of those groups had state-level political organizations with bureaucracies and institutions of organized religions and leadership and taxes and tribute and all of those structures that we're very familiar with living in a state-level society like we do. Those are present in Mesoamerica at the institutional level. And the monopoly on force that exists in state-level societies is also present here in Mesoamerica. You don't see that kind of political organization in the Southwest. You have market economies in Mesoamerica, currencies, fixed prices for different kinds of products, true marketplaces with standards of weights and measures, another one of the state-level contributions. You see those kinds of market economies in Mesoamerica, and those are absent in a fully developed form from the Southwest. And you see true cities, and we can talk about that definition on the discussion boards if you like. Cities are unique from just large concentrations of population. They have a number of characteristics that define them, one of which is that they're not self-sufficient in terms of subsistence. The city doesn't grow enough food inside the city limits to support itself, and so it's dependent upon goods and services coming from the surrounding hinterlands into the city, and this existence of the city as a primate center that has more markets, more demand, more labor, all of that distinguishes a city from its surrounding areas is also something that is not well developed in the Southwest. These pueblos along the Rio Grande and at Hopi and Zuni are largely self-contained communities. There is trade and exchange between them, but it's more in the form of luxury items rather than subsistence goods. And the hinterlands in the very arid and oasis-like nature of the Southwest are not producing more than the areas immediately around the pueblos. Those are the centers of agricultural production. The Mesoamerica has stepped pyramids, right? None of those in the Southwest. They have precise calendrical systems and advanced astronomy. Not saying that the Southwest didn't have astronomy or astronomical alignments, but the level of science that the Mesoamerican traditions took this to was a whole nother level. And that can clearly be seen in the calendrical systems possessed by all of those different groups that I mentioned earlier. They also had hieroglyphic writing systems and books. These are absent from the Southwest. And I think importantly, especially in some of the debates about violence in prehistory, in Mesoamerica you see standing military forces. You have armies where people's full-time job is to be a soldier. And that is not present at all in the Southwest. You do not see standing armies, and nobody is a full-time soldier. Right, so here, this is Tenochtitlan, and you can see there on the left, the Templo Mayor, the great temple of the Colhua Mexica, right, sometimes referred to as Aztecs. You can see one of the canals here with its gondola-like canoe being pushed along there. This is a state-level society. This is Mesoamerica, right? These are some of the Mesoamerican codices, the screenfold books and writing and systemized and standardized traditions. So those things can kind of give you a boundary to the south. If you start to see stepped pyramids and books and things like that, then you're in Mesoamerica. But there's a lot of other things, especially when we get to some of the later lectures after this one. There's a lot of other things that are very parallel. They're playing, in some instances, some of the same games, some of the same sports in Mesoamerica and the Southwest. They're certainly growing the same foods. They're exchanging goods. Turquoise from New Mexico is ending up in the Cenote de Sacrificios at Chichen Itza. So they're very connected and very tied into each other. There's chocolate at Chaco Canyon in northern New Mexico, and that's coming all the way from southern Mesoamerica, Chiapas, Guatemala. So the connections are there, but just like they are between California and the Southwest, there's connections and people are moving back and forth. But when you've got those state-level political organizations, standing armies, bureaucracies, taxes, books, all of that, that's Mesoamerica as opposed to the Southwest. Maize, again, hard to overstate the importance of this. You begin to see it both in small quantities and small forms that you see on the left here in the Southwest around 2100 BCE, but it doesn't really begin to be produced as a staple of the diet until quite a few centuries later. You can see here kind of some of the evolution, or not evolution, but development of this crop through the first few centuries of its domestication. And importantly, the genetic studies that we now have access to have clearly identified the point of origin for the first maize in the Southwest as coming from the Mexican highlands. So central Mexico, the Valley of Mexico, Oaxaca, the Mexican highland area is where the source of maize is coming from initially into the Southwest, as opposed to the lowland varieties of maize. And please read this article. I know you can't click on this screen here in the video, but the link is on my discussion board post on Canvas. So please read this short Smithsonian Magazine article. It's very informative, talking about maize in the Southwest, and this will be part of the curriculum that you'll be expected to have mastered for things like midterm examinations. So please look for that link on the discussion board. So when is the Southwest? Right? If we know kind of what it is and how it supports itself. If you look at the Paleo-Indian and Archaic periods, there's very little that kind of distinguishes the Southwest from adjacent areas. There's Clovis points in Sonora and Texas and Colorado and California, as well as in the area that we're talking about as the Southwest. So what is it that separates it? When can we see something that defines it? Those points that we talked about, distinguishing it from the neighbors. Really, it's kind of during Basket Maker II, early Basket Maker II, around 1500 BC. You see long-term seasonal use of caves, storage and using for storage and burial, camp and limited activity sites in the open. They're still not using pottery at this point in time in the Southwest. They're still atlatl and darts are still the principal weapon system, but you do see corn and squash beginning to be cultivated in small quantities in prime areas for this. So this is kind of right on the edge here. You can say, well, maybe this is kind of like the Southwest. When you look here at this stretch, beginning around the turn of the first millennium, from BC to AD changeover, right? You can see that you've got the beginning of pit house dwellings. You begin to see ceramics being made consistently. You begin to see villages, and you begin to see more and more agriculture coming in right around that time period. And this is kind of where you begin to see the Southwest as being something distinct very clearly from adjacent areas. And that distinction only increases with every passing decade in this sequence. I won't read through this whole chart for you, but you should. And because it gives you a good idea of what some of these time frames are and what's going on during these various portions of time that archaeologists have defined for the Southwest. And it culminates, this kind of period beginning around like I said, the turn of the millennium, the first millennium. It culminates in Pueblo II, Pueblo III, with the Chaco phenomenon, the great pueblos of Chaco and Aztec and other sites there, particularly in the Four Corners area. It's a little bit different in some areas like the Hohokam that we'll talk about later. But this time period really is the period when you see that explosion of occupation. Many of the archaeological sites that we're familiar with that are iconic for the Southwest occurred during Pueblo II and III, including the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, for example. Finally, it's after the collapse of that Chaco phenomenon and the reformation of society along very different lines, which we'll speak about at length here as the semester continues, that you get the formation of the societies that we recognize today as being directly ancestral to contemporary First Nations in the region. Zuni, Hopi, Tewa, these people, their identifiable patterns can really be seen during Pueblo IV, beginning around 1300, AD 1300, and obviously running up to and through contact. This is really the kind of period in which many of the contemporary First Nations traditions crystallize in forms that are recognizable today. If we look here at some of the contemporary tribal groups of the Southwest in the United States of America, you see along the whole western edge, you see the Yuman-speaking populations, all of the various Pais, Havasupai, Wallapai, Yavapai, very close relatives to the Kumeyaay of the San Diego area and Southern California, and the Baja California groups that we've spoken about already. You then see the Hopi and Zuni groups, some of the very closest descendants to the inhabitants of the Chaco Four Corners area. Traditions are there at Hopi and Zuni. You also see some of the other groups, the Tono O'odham and Pima, there in southern Arizona. And you see these various Athapascan groups, the Apache, kind of spread around these areas, as well as the Navajo, who, as you know, we're going to be speaking quite a... As you know, the Navajo will be speaking about quite a bit as the semester goes on, included one of the books that we're reading. And these people are very much still here. You've got Zuni dancers here in 2017, very much present. Navajo Technical University graduation of 2018. The Navajo have really led the way in terms of indigenous development of their own educational systems, including developing a medical school recently. So while we talk about these deep traditions and past of Pueblo 1 and 2 and all of that, it's very, very important to emphasize that these are very contemporary people living in the context within the Navajo Nation and on their own tribal lands, within the context of North American United States society, and adapting and integrating and dealing with it in different ways, using different strategies, but very much in our world and existing in the present. Here you can see a map of the contemporary tribal groups in northwest Mexico. Groups there that we already talked about in previous lectures, the Kumeyaay, Cocopah, Paipai, Cochimin, Kiliwa, there in northwest Baja California, sort of outside the southwest, if you will. As well as you'll notice on this map, they show Mixtecos, Zapotec, and Triqui as actually occupying an area there between San Quintin and El Rosario. Actually mapped the density of these indigenous communities, even though they're immigrants from the Mexican state of Oaxaca to Baja California. And that area is one of the areas in Baja California that produces a great deal of agriculture. In fact, if you buy cherry tomatoes in the little plastic clamshells at Trader Joe's, very often the source for those is that region. In the more traditional Southwest sense of the term, you can see, depending on how you divide it up, 8 or 9 different contemporary tribal groups recognized by the Mexican government in northwest Mexico. The Papago there that straddle the U.S.-Mexican border, the Seri on the dry Sonoran coast west of Hermosillo, the famous and renowned Yaqui there, also on the southern coast of Sonora. The Pima, you can see there in 2 groups. This is the lower Pima, the southern groups of Pima. Other groups of Pima you find further north in Arizona. The Tarahumara, famous for their ability to run, and they're occupying the area of Copper Canyon, one of the more beautiful places in northwest Mexico. The Mayo, the Guarijo, and the Tepehuanos are shown there in their different areas, including the southern Tepehuans that are actually south of Durango in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. So you can see there's an extension of these groups that is genuinely impressive, and genuinely impressive for a number of reasons. One, that you see this continuity of tradition across such a wide area, but also that as many of these groups have managed to navigate and resist the tides of colonialism and European imperialism for so many centuries, and yet still be able to preserve their traditions in such a strong way. Here you can see some individuals in Raramuri Tarahumara. Raramuri is how they refer to themselves. Traditional attire. And on the right here, you see Andres Garcia, who's a Raramuri long-distance runner and member of the 2020 Mexican Olympic team, which unfortunately sounds like it's going to be the 2021 Olympic team. But nonetheless, you can see that, as I was mentioning before, these are people living in our world today. They're not separate from it. They're not apart. They're not frozen in time. And nor are they separating themselves completely from the goings-on of the nations that they live in. They are managing to do both things, managing to both preserve their centuries-old traditions as well as make their way in an increasingly complex world, and that's true both for themselves and us, I feel. So why does our way of defining things matter? Why does how we talk about the Southwest matter one way or another? This is your discussion board posting assignment for this week. One full paragraph, 4 or 5 sentences. They should be complete sentences, though. Just give me your view on this. Not looking for dissertation length discussions. One full paragraph, complete sentences. Talk about it. Why does our way of defining the Southwest matter? And how can different ways of defining it change how we understand these things? I really look forward to seeing some of your comments. Remember also to read that Smithsonian Magazine article, as well as your other readings for the week. And I hope to see you guys either in office hours, which remember are Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday from 11 to noon on Zoom. And I also look forward to seeing your discussion board posts. Have a wonderful day. Talk to you soon.